This is the last session.
Second, we get one more second.
No,
There
it's
is
a
one more.
second.
This- Oh, I see.
Somebody's gonna back clean up to you.
I see. Okay, fine. So, oh, that takes the pressure off. All right. So, if you take a look at your class outline, the subjects that we're going to be approaching this morning start with 1B, the time frame and geography of the book. So rather than actually point to each thing in the outline that we're going to do, I will refer back to them as we move. But let's start with 1B, and you will also be able to look at a list of the parts of Shemot, of Exodus. It has chapters 1 through 40 in the left column. So if you have that in front of you, you'll see something I think rather interesting. There are aspects to this book which really are a kind of underlying calendar of the Jewish people. So for example, if you just look at the chart, you'll see that as you go to the second column, we go from left to right here, okay? So if you look at the second column, it divides into three parts, right? There's the time spent in Egypt, then there's the transitional time where there's a journey to Mount Sinai, and we're not talking about the entire sojourn in the wilderness here. We're talking only about, if you look in the right column, you'll see that's only 49 days. And then finally, at Mount Sinai. Now look at the column on the right, the period. Okay. So first of all, when do we leave Egypt? We leave Egypt on what day on the Jewish calendar? The 15th of Nisan, which in holiday terms is Pesach. Okay. So that's when we leave Egypt. Then we spend approximately a year in Egypt, not altogether in Egypt, spend many more than that in Egypt, but we spend a year in the book of Exodus in Egypt. That's when the story kicks in. And we leave Egypt on Pesach. Then we journey to Mount Sinai, and that takes, according to the traditional way of counting this, 49 days. What does that correspond to on our current calendar? You're absolutely right. It corresponds to the approach to Shavuot, which is also called Sephirah, or counting, Sefirat HaOmer, counting the Omer. So that is observed, that aspect of the book of Exodus is observed on the Jewish calendar. Then we get to Mount Sinai, and the Ten Commandments are given. And although the date is not absolutely clear in the Torah, in the Talmud, it's more or less clear. Of course, everything in the Talmud has to be a dispute. So there's not unanimity that the Ten Commandments were given on the 6th of Sivan, but the alternative view is only one day different. So it's close enough. Okay, and so that happens at the beginning of the Mount Sinai period. And then we have a period of 120 days. Now, of what significance in your mind is 120 days? If it's years.
Years.
But literally days. What significance would 120 mean? Well, if you divide it by 3, you get 3 periods of 40 days. Now, how long did Moses stay on the mountain with God? 40 days. But actually, he did it 3 times. So this is a succession of 3 periods of 40 days on the mountain. And we'll actually look at that. We'll break that up in just a moment. And then he comes down from the mountain on the 10th of Tishrei. You see that? What's the 10th of Tishrei? Yom Kippur. Close, but it's Yom Kippur. Okay? And then they spend another 6 months building the first synagogue, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the forerunner of the permanent temple in Jerusalem. This was a portable synagogue that moved with them throughout the wilderness. But it took them 6 months to build it, and it was dedicated, as you can see, on the 1st of Nisan. What's the significance of the 1st of Nisan? Now we're coming almost full circle to Pesach, right? Pesach is the 15th of Nisan. What's the significance of the 1st of Nisan? There's no great, amazing answer to this, but it's kind of a modest answer.
Isn't that another of the beginning of the year?
Very good, that's right. There are different competing New Years in Jewish tradition, and the 1st of Nisan, which occurs in the spring, of course, is one of those New Years. And it actually is the basis upon which the Torah numbers months. In other words, it doesn't give the names of months as we use them today, but it talks about the 1st month or the 7th month. It's all coming from this month of Nisan. And being the 1st of the month, it's Rosh Chodesh. It's a kind of a holiday, more important in ancient times than it is today. It's still important today, but in ancient times it was apparently very important. So the Mishkan was dedicated on Rosh Chodesh of Nisan. Yes?
I don't interrupt
No, go ahead.
you. It also is, dictates when everything else is. If Pesach is early, everything is early.
That's
If
right.
Pesach, so it's very important in our movement through the year.
Right. Now, that's absolutely true. It's not reflected here, but it's true because the leap year is determined by a month that's added right before the 1st of Nisan. Now, if you look at in my book here, it's on the other side. I don't know how you received it, but there's another chart that breaks down. Moshe spent 120 days on Mount Sinai. If you take a look at that, the first part of the chart is those 49 days of transit from Egypt to Sinai. But the next 3 sections of the chart, you see on the left column 40, 40, 40. Okay, so here you can see what he did on those trips up to Mount Sinai. First, he goes up and he gets the tablets, and while he's up there, of course, we build the golden calf, and he comes down and he encounters the people dancing around the golden calf, and he shatters the tablets. Not a good day. Now, that day is, the rabbis figure it out, that is Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. That's the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. Okay? Now, what do you know? Does anybody know anything about the 17th of Tammuz? It's a fast day, and it commemorates some of the initial events in the fall of the temple. So it is a bad day. And while you won't find the numbering explicit, if you read in the Torah, you won't find it explicit. In the Talmud and in the commentaries, they establish this calendar. It's like a parallel universe, but it's the same universe that goes parallel to the written Torah that gives us these dates. So all of these events that we read about are actually occurring on days that we observe on the calendar. However you observe it, even if you just have a calendar in your home, you're observing it in a way, they're on the calendar, and they have connections. Now, what makes Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th day of Tammuz, a bad day and therefore a fast day, isn't always consciously directly because of Moses' shattering the tablets, but the rabbis make that connection. And then the second 40 days, he goes up to gain atonement for the people, and comes back ready to institute the 10 Commandments on the tablets again, to carve the second tablets. And then in the third period of the 40th day, these tablets are engraved, and Moses comes back on the 10th of Tishrei, as we've already established, Yom Kippur. This becomes the major day of reconciliation. Now, if you have a sense of this, it serves as a background to observance throughout the year. I mean, I can't say that Yom Kippur is my favorite holiday. It really is not. But, and I can only say that because I actually have a favorite holiday. So I'm not just denigrating Yom Kippur. But I'm always amazed and in utter respect for what Yom Kippur means to the Jewish people. And you know that, everybody's going to have his or her own interpretation of what it means to you. I would just emphasize this word again. It's reconciliation, historically, and for each of us, perhaps in terms of our personal lives, and for many Jews who don't do much that's explicitly religious as Jews during the year. Maybe on Yom Kippur they do something, and that's a kind of reconciliation with their tradition. It's an amazing institution, and the source of it is here. Now, after he comes down, Yom Kippur.
Can I ask just one question? At least, if I haven't been told, I assume that on the third trip to Mount Sinai is when all the people were there, or is that not? I mean, when were we supposed to all be at Mount Sinai and receive the commandments ourselves?
The people appear to have been there all the time.
All
The
the
entire time.
time.
Yeah.
Okay. So how could they build the camp if they were on Mount Sinai?
They weren't on Mount Sinai. They were at the foot of Mount Sinai. Right.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, the camp that they built, and this certainly relates to Exodus, in many ways is a kind of reconstruction or emulation of Sinai. They were at Sinai, which is the ultimate place of God's revelation, but eventually they would move away from Sinai, and they took some of Mount Sinai with them in spirit, if not actually physically, with the Ten Commandments. They took it and they created camps along the way, and they encamped around the Mishkan, apparently in the same way that they encamped around Mount Sinai. And today, when we build synagogues, the drama of the synagogue is really a reenactment of Mount Sinai. We treat the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, which contains the Ten Commandments, and it's an expansion of the Ten Commandments, with utter sanctity. We have its own housing, and we sit around it. We encamp around it in the synagogue, so that in many ways it's a continuation. The synagogue itself, continuation of the temple, which is a continuation of the Mishkan, which is a continuation of Mount Sinai. Now, after Yom Kippur, what comes on our calendar? And you probably either saw or heard the idea of, after you've gone through the entire day of Yom Kippur, you fasted and so forth and so on, that the very next thing you do is, I'm not sure exactly when you break the fast, never is clear to me, but the point is that the next thing you do is you go outside and you start building your sukkah, right? And it was always explained to me as, we never stop engaging in mitzvot, and there might be a tendency after Yom Kippur to just want to sort of sit back, okay, it's over now. But you go and you prepare for the next, holiday. But the idea here, that's brought out here, is that what happened after Moses comes down with the Ten Commandments, the people start to build, when he comes down the second time, the Ten Commandments, the successful time, the people start to build the Mishkan. And so our starting to build the Sukkah is a parallel to the people's starting to build the Mishkan. And in many ways, the Sukkah, which you may think of as a kind of very modest hut, the Sukkah is the most Jewish dwelling. We live in homes of varying degrees of splendor, but the home can be made into a Jewish home. Put a mezuzah on it, have Jewish things happening in the home, a Jewish life in the home, but the home itself is still a kind of secular enclosure. But the sukkah is a completely Jewish thing. Everything about the sukkah is commanded. That the wall should be this way, the roof should be that way, the size of it this way, the height this way. And so the sukkah really in many ways can be seen as a kind of repeat mishkan, or like a kind of a emulation of the temple. And so it corresponds in its building to the time that the children of Israel started to build the Mishkan. Okay. Now, getting back to the next step of our outline. If you look at 1C, of course, what we realize when you look at the book of Exodus just from a literary point of view, that it really is a kind of a transition away from what we had in Genesis, which is a narrative, series of stories, to a presentation of laws. It happens gradually. And then if you go to the next book, Leviticus, Vayikra, that's primarily laws, and the narrative is much less. So that's one of the sort of changes of the color of things in the Torah that happens when we move through Exodus. Now on the outline, we're going to turn to number 3, Covenant at Sinai. And here it probably would be good to look in the Torah at chapter 24, verses 4 through 8. Chapter 24, verses 4 through 8. Now, this covenant that we're going to look at is called by our outline the third stage. And it occurs to me that I think I know what they mean, but it could mean it in either of two ways. It is, if you looked at, you don't necessarily have to look back, but the first outline that we looked at, there are 3 parts of that outline that I pointed out earlier. Egypt, the journey to Mount Sinai, and Mount Sinai itself. So in some ways, the covenant is at Mount Sinai. It's the third stage of the journey. But what I think they really mean is that there were 2 other covenants that were given earlier. Okay? And one was the covenant with Adam. Second stage was the covenant with Abraham. This is the third stage. This is the covenant with Moses. And we just use these names, Adam, Abraham, Moshe, as they're just the instruments. The covenant is made beyond those people with a group. Now let's take a look at those verses. Chapter 24, verses 4 through 8. Would somebody volunteer to read? Well, that's probably what we probably could put the covenant with Noah and Adam pretty much in the same category. I was just using the outline that the course uses. Okay, so I accept your emendation. But for the purposes of trying to make this conform with the course, and I think there's a good reason actually that the covenant with Adam and with Noah were similar. But I'd like to talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so hold that idea in mind. Yes, Marcia.
Moses then wrote down all the commands of the Lord. Early in the morning, he set up an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 poles with 12 tribes of Israel. He designated some young men among the Israelites, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls and offerings of red meat to the Lord. Moses took one part of the blood and put it in a basin, and the other part of the blood he dashed against the ark. Then he took the record from the covenant and read it aloud to the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will faithfully do. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord then makes you concerning all these things.
Okay, now if this were a drama and I were the director, I would say, Marcia, go back and I want you to emphasize the word people. You find that in the verse? It's one of the later verses.
He read it aloud to the people.
And continue.
And they said, all that the Lord had spoken will faithfully do.
And continue.
Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people.
Right. Okay. So this blood was actually thrown on the people. Okay. So we have here another theme that recurs, and that is the theme of commandment and of covenant, but also of blood. Now, actually, to be fair about this course, I think that Tamar's point is actually going to correct what I said. The first covenant wasn't with Adam, I see it that way, but it was really with Noah. Okay, so let's just concentrate on that. So what was there, if anything, about blood in the covenant with Noah? Everybody knows that the covenant was indicated by the sign of the rainbow. Is there any kind of blood involved in that covenant? Okay, so when they came out of the ark, they made sacrifice, right? And there was also blood implied, a kind of human blood implied, because you had a law that said if anybody takes another person's life, their blood will be shed. So there's a kind of, that's part of the covenant, so there's a sort of implied human blood there. And then what about the covenant with Abraham, where it was human blood involved? Circumcision. So here again, we have the theme of blood. This time it's not human blood, but it's cast upon the people. Now, the first covenant, you might say, with Noah, was a kind of universal covenant. It was with all life. Okay. What about the covenant with Abraham? Yes, it seems to be, and would you say it was the Jewish people? Put it in the context of the patriarchal stories.
So it was Abraham and his descendants.
Yeah, his descendants. It was more like a family. And then this covenant, you could see, because all the family has grown into a people with various tribes, that they are gathered together now, and they are a nascent people. And I thought that we might just stop here for a moment and think. It seems to me that these different types of covenant resonate, each of these types resonates with Jews today in different ways. I mean, it certainly does with me, especially as I look in terms of my own personal life history. But what about with you? Are all of these types of covenant pretty much the same in their importance to you? Does one present itself as being much more compelling than the others? Does one present itself as being something that you would like to deny, move away from, or have moved away from in the past? How do you feel? We have covenant with all of humanity. That's the first one. Then we have a covenant with the family, second one. Then we have a covenant with the Jewish people. What's your first name? Rachel.
I think each of the elements resonates differently with people, but really all in general.
Do you think?
People, the fact that different people are more into communities, different people more family is what helps us grow.
So you do acknowledge that different Jews may feel more conviction with respect to one of these covenants than with the other one. Yeah. Okay. Can we- Interesting is a really permissible, permitting kind of word. Is there anything else that you'd want to say about how interesting it is?
That would be part of
All right. Well, when you come to be able to summarize it, share it with us. Okay. Yes. What's your first name?
Barbara. I was struck the same way. One might at first think your top priority is, say, protection of your immediate family. But in fact, this is the whole nation, then the immediate family, and then the Jewish people. And I think that does resonate. I think we know in our history of an attitude of sometimes we have to sacrifice or risk our personal families' safety for the sake of the Jewish people. So that is consistent with the Jewish people being the final hierarchy.
I see it as more demanding, sort of the beginning of the request is a covenant. And then with the family, it becomes a little bit more restrictive. And then with Sinai, it becomes even more restrictive with the various requirements of the different groups. So I really see it as being more, growing more than.
Would I be misinterpreting what you're saying by suggesting this? That it is perhaps easier to take responsibility for everybody than to take responsibility for one person. I mean, I don't know if that's, I just put it like in very
Well, yeah,
broad
it's,
terms.
it's not as demanding for everyone
Right.
as you would demand for yourself, I would think, and I'll go with that. But then I think it goes on to demanding for a group.
For me also, the order was, jumped out at me, but in a different way. For me, it's a little mixed up, or, I would not have created such an order. For me, perhaps hierarchical is the way you might think about it. But for me, it would be your family first, that you have a covenant with the people closest to you. Then the Jewish people, and then all of humanity. And it kind of, for me, focuses on something I'm very involved in, and that's interfaith. That before you can be strong with your own, you need to be strong with your own before you can feel safe and care about the other. So for me, it should have been family, Jewish people, and humanity.
The order which you illustrated that, and I think which also Barbara was talking about, is actually the Talmudic way of setting up priorities. First, your first priority is for your own family. This is in terms of tzedakah. And then for your city, and then for people outside of your city. But this clearly, at least in the order in which it's presented in the Torah, is a little bit different.
That was actually what Rabbi Dariashi talked about last week in production.
Right.
There's that other,
To me, it shows that by starting with all of humanity, or all the people, all the religions, that's everybody, and then we get to children's, God creates the world and people, and something goes wrong. And so everybody has to that's not gonna happen anymore, now we're gonna try again. Now, Jewish people, it's Abraham, and that's small, and chooses.
If you
Yeah,
look
so-
at it reverse order though, you're following the blood. So first the blood is all humanity, and then the blood is Abraham's blood, and then that grows into the people.
Okay, but there's still, isn't there still a backtrack? I think this was Marshall was saying, kind of a backtrack from the first covenant to the second covenant, and because something goes wrong, it doesn't work in some way, but not from the second covenant to the third covenant. That seems to be more of a sort of natural outgrowth. Were there any other?
Just a question.
Yes.
When you talk about Abraham's family, are you including Ishmael? Because I was listening to the radio about these scholars who are trying to, they all come from Abraham, and he was actually circumcised, Ishmael.
Right.
So that would be, so they were saying that we're all one family, the Muslim, and Israel should, or Palestine should be shared.
Right.
That was their theological thing.
Well, the Jewish covenant, I think it's safe to say, doesn't include, from the Jewish point of view, does not include Ishmael. And Ishmael's, importance and significance is certainly presented in this week's Torah portion, this week's Parsha, by the way. But on the other hand, things are often not black or white. And so, yes, if you look at the Dam Brit, the blood of the covenant, it's something that Ishmael participated in. because he was circumcised in the Torah. And then, Muslims do that as well. So, they see themselves as part of that. Okay?
I do see I think a common denominator in terms of the Jewish intent. If we all emerge, if we think of the primordial group, we all emerge, first of all, humanity, and then we start to, form the particulars of the family. However, if it just stopped there, then we'd just be one family among many nations. But we are other, and we are chosenness for a purpose, so that it evolves spiritually and in terms of our destiny to then become something known as the Jewish people.
I infer from that a kind of obverse lesson, and that is that if it stopped at family, then our uniqueness could be considered ethnocentric, even racist. But when it expands into people with a kind of special mission and the covenant of the people, which is the Torah, then it becomes a positive reason to maintain separateness. Now, I don't know that you were saying that,
Sure.
but I was
Absolutely.
sort of.
Thank you. Oh, no, I didn't make it clear. Yes, that, again, we are not chosen because we're smart or we're this or that, but we have a special purpose and lighting to nations, and it is actually a heavy burden as our freedom and a responsibility. So I see that is a natural progression, even if you think of it in terms of a Darwinian evolution. That would Darwin would probably stop from all humanity to the particulars of the family, but then our mission is broader. And in fact, what are we if we are only a family?
It transcends
It's with monotheism and Jewish tradition.
Okay. Take a look at, just very, very briefly, 3D. As a people, one interesting aspect of this being a people, before we even get to 10 Commandments, in chapter 19, you don't necessarily have to look this up, but when you have a chance, you should. God has a private interview with Moses before he gives the 10 Commandments, and he tells Moses what to tell the people by way of explanation. And one of the things he says is that tell them that they're going to be a mamlechet kohanim. They're going to be a kingdom of kohanim, of priests. And the point has been made most recently by Chief Rabbi of England, Rabbi Sachs, but it's been made by other people too, that being a kingdom of priests is really a very distinctive role of the Jewish people. And one of the things that it emphasizes is that there should be among us as Jews universal literacy, not just to be able to read, but to understand. The Jews need to be educated in Judaism, and that's what Mamlechet Kohanim means, at least in part. That what are the priests? The priests in most religions are those people who know, who have the information. And so if you're not a priest, you go to the priest and you get the information. Maybe in the early stages of the development of Judaism, maybe that's what the Kohanim did, but they certainly are generally not portrayed that way. They are people that are kind of a conduit of God's blessing to the people. But knowledge is a universal priesthood among the Jewish people. So this is, certainly part of this covenant. Now, take a look now at section 5, the name of God. You started this last time, and one of the points that is made in chapter 6, verses 2 through 5, if you want to turn to that. Chapter 6, verses 2 through 5. And you can kind of just scan it, that when God introduces his name, and this is an important part of Exodus, of Shemot, God gives his name. It's an interesting coincidence because the name of the book in Hebrew is Shemot, which means names, although it's not referring to God's name. But the point is referring to the names of the children of Israel. But still, God's name is important, and God introduces himself. And it's not that important whether it's, strictly speaking, exactly consistent with Genesis. But the point is, God says that when I give you my real name, it has some significance. And one of the points of significance is that, and we have that in these verses 2 through 5, at least implied, God is saying that whereas in the past I have promised certain things, now in this point, with this name privy, to which you are privy, I am going to produce. I'm going to fulfill the promises that I've made. So that's another significance of God's name. But then look at C, and I think you did a little bit of this the last time. I don't know how much exactly, so I don't want to duplicate. But C talks about the complexity or the difficulty of God's name. You know, complexity is can sometimes be a very complimentary term. Sometimes, you know, if a person is completely messed up, you say, he's very complex. Well, maybe. But the point is, and that may be true about God too. I'm not sure that I would want to make that statement, because God is supposed to be simple, you know, complete unity. But whatever, God's name, as he presents it in chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, is difficult to understand, and some would say complex. He introduces himself as Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh, which can be translated as I am what I am, I shall be what I shall be, and other kinds of sophisticated translations. If you look at the, it's a double page that has the commentaries on I am what I am. It contains the commentary of Rashi, of Maimonides, and then on the opposite page, George Steiner. So we don't have time to go into these fully. The commentary on Rashi, I do want to just summarize it, is that we take a look maybe also, just I will read chapter 3, verse 14, just so that it's sort of on the table. Moses asks him, what is his name? What should I tell the people is your name? And in verse 14, Vayomer Elohim el Moshe, God said to Moses, Eyeh asher eyeh. Vayomer. And then he says, after he gives him this, you know, his three names, he says, thus shall you say to the children of Israel, Eheyeh has sent me to you. I always love this. It's like, you know, you can use my first name, you know, or maybe my last name. So that's not the thing. But the point is that first God gives him Eyeh asher eyeh, and then he says, almost as if he's sort of having a second thought, tell you what, just tell them Eyeh sent you. Okay. So Rashi's trying to deal with that. And he's saying that Moses understood as soon as God gave him this complex name, this was not going to work. Not with the people that he knew. They weren't ready for this. And so he convinced God of this. And God said, okay, just tell them Eyeh. In other words, just give them part of who I am, like, assuming names are who you are. Okay? So that's all that Rashi says here. Now, then we get Maimonides. And again, because of time, we're not going to actually read the whole thing. But Maimonides is trying to explain by the way, Hebrew wasn't even considered to be good enough to explain these ideas that Maimonides has. So he wrote them in Arabic. And although we have a Hebrew text here for Maimonides, it's a Hebrew translation that was made in the Middle Ages. so that more Jews would have access to Maimonides. And by the way, and in doing this translation, Shmuel ibn Tibbon, who is the translator, created philosophical terms for Hebrew that had never existed before. So anyway, what Maimonides is trying to explain is that God, when he uses this name, what God is saying is, I am totally different than anything else. Anything else has its essence and it has its attributes. Meaning it has what it is and what you know about it, what you can tell about it, what you can say about it. I, God says, am entirely different. My essence are my attributes. My attributes are my essence. There's no separation between me and what I am like or perceived to be. And so actually I am necessary existence. Other things may or may not exist. I have to exist. I don't choose to exist. I have to exist. That's the way Maimonides explains it. And then Steiner goes into a kind of literary description of what the implications of that are for us, and how difficult it is to carry this absolutely demanding, abstract idea of God. And he even says that it's led to anti-Semitism, because people don't like that about us. This is his thesis. What I wanted to point out was, of all these three opinions, the last two, I think it's fair to say, you really won't find in the Torah. These are medieval interpretations of what the Torah is saying. It's only Rashi that just deals with possibly what the Torah itself is saying. And even that, he goes a little bit further. But what you have, it's important, since we're really studying Tanakh, to understand that you shouldn't feel or think that Maimonides and Steiner are actually telling you what the Torah is saying. The Torah doesn't present itself in that kind of sophisticated philosophical way. And if anything, philosophy is really the product of Greek culture. But Jews engaged in philosophy because they were engaged in not just Jewish culture, but the intellectual currents of their day. And so somebody like Maimonides wrote this book that this is taken from, The Guide of the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim. He wrote it because he wanted to try to show that you could resolve some of these Greek philosophical thoughts with the Bible, with Judaism. Okay. But it's not the same thing as just dealing with the Bible. So I wanted to just, give a kind of a perspective on that. Now, we come now, I think, to the last thing that we're going to deal with together, and so I'm sure that Elise will make note of that so that next time you fill in what we didn't get to. This is in section 6. We start with B, the meeting point. This has to do with what occupies a good part of the book of Exodus after the interviews that God holds with Moses on Mount Sinai, the series of 40 days, and we are now at the point where the tabernacle is built. Okay? So here's the question. If you've looked at the outline, perhaps, what's the relationship between the events at Mount Sinai and the building of the tabernacle? By the way, I don't think there's any one right answer, but there are some answers that people thought of. What's the relationship between the events at Mount Sinai and the building of the tabernacle? Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, one of the things that God commanded, maybe not in the Ten Commandments, but in some of the other laws that follow the Ten Commandments, some of which were given while they were at Mount Sinai, God commands that they should build a Mishkan, they should build a tabernacle. So the connection is, they went to Mount Sinai, they were given a mission as a people, and part of that mission is to have a physical place to present yourself to God. And it is actually represented as a kind of home for God. God says, they shall build for me a tabernacle, and I shall meet them there. So it's not just our house of prayer, it's God's house of habitation. Can you think now of any other possible relationship between the events at Mount Sinai and the building of the Mishkan?
Well, first of all, even though it was portable at a point, it's concrete and it's permanent. So that you go from oral and the children building the golden calf, there's a marked transformation and evolution toward an actual people who are going to observe, so that it comes from thinking to doing, and in perpetuity, because you now have something that is permanent and that you will then continue to fulfill.
Okay,
that relationship.
So that it's not just a commandment, it's a kind of a natural consequence of their having this experience as
And they accept it.
as they move
They
away
do
from
it, and they do it.
All right. Any other ideas? So while Noreen gave a kind of a positive reason, Marcia gave a kind of a negative reason. And this both of these reasons have been not only suggested, but there are disputes about it, in the literature, rabbinic literature. But just to make sure we all understand the negative reason, because it may be one that's less familiar to people, is that the intention was to have the revelation at Mount Sinai, and then to get on with our lives. But we didn't respond too well to that. In other words, we weren't able to, we demonstrated that we couldn't leave Mount Sinai with the idea of a visible God, with all of the strength that George Steiner sees in that notion. We've demonstrated that we can't leave Mount Sinai with that, because you know what? Even while we were at Mount Sinai, we didn't have it. And we failed. So that God actually gave the Mishkan as a kind of compromise, as a kind of concession to the human need to still have some sense of physical place for God. Okay? What do you think?
Do you think it's also,
What's your first name?
Tracy, that they need a place to be a congregation and to have ceremony, and not just sort of everybody on their own? That they need a place to come together as a people and
I don't know how many times I've explained why we have synagogues in that way. But the truth of the matter is that you do find in the Torah places where God says, it shall be a place in which I will dwell.
I look at it in a very simplistic way. The kids are outside playing, and they have nothing else to do, so they end up doing something that perhaps is mystical. And if they have a place to go to on a regular basis that kind of reinforces the relationship with God or the belief in God, then when they come out, they're not going to be as mischievous.
So it's a little bit like keeping them off the streets, but more sophisticated than that.
But it's in a very broad sense.
Yeah, and that is a little different than some of the other explanations that we've heard. Okay, Rachel.
I'm sorry.
Mhm. Right. So that the process that we go through in building the Mishkan and perhaps also building synagogues and so forth, and between those two things, building the temple, is a unifying effort.
Well, is this a learning of, God is learning about the psychology of men?
Right. You always
Shouldn't
have
he
that.
already know that?
Sure. Right. You always have that problem in that kind of explanation that why couldn't God have anticipated, that people would, sin? Why did He have to destroy the world? Didn't He know that people were going to do that? I'm not going to solve that problem in 30 seconds. But the point is, yeah, and so that's a criticism of those explanations, that try to account for that. On the other hand, you can look at it this way, and that these are metaphors for, the disappointed efforts of idealistic human beings to reach for something greater, and so these explanations sort of really tell us more about ourselves than about God.
I think that originally God wanted us to think and feel that He was everywhere, which personally I still do. Given that He was weary that we would do that and could do that, He gave us a limited place, the Mishkan, the synagogue, to connect with Him. And so I can almost think of it as a punishment because we're so focused on thinking when we're in the synagogue we're close to God, and often forget that we're equally and perhaps even more so closer to God when we're connected with nature.
Interesting. Kind of a punishment.
There's another very critical element here that I think was definitely alluded to, and that is in community. Jews don't go onto the top of the mountain and meditate by themselves. So that, but there's a balance because we celebrate in the home, which is another very tradition-filled, and if we wake up in the morning, we say our prayers, so there's a lot of opportunity for one-on-one. But there are a number of things having to do with his dominion. We need to do certain things in community. And there's a place to go, meeting house, so that serves many purposes, and I think that's a very, very important one. And it's a reminder, because we humans are weak, and we get involved in a whole host of things. And so it establishes continuity, a schedule, and that we do it together with the rest of our community, which of course has many, many benefits to be doing something in the community.
Yeah, just to look at the words and to think about what the words actually say, which is, let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. That is so different. Everything, God's been up there, going up to the Mount Sinai. If we left God up there and then went back to our life down here without God, just taking those words, that bringing God down on earth, amongst us, with us, living with us, in the sanctuary, but in our homes, that just changes the whole relationship to me.
Well, along those lines, let me conclude our session by sharing with you a midrash that certainly supports the last idea, and even if Barbara hadn't brought it up, I would have just thrown this in as another possible reason. This midrash explains why God said that verse from His own point of view, in other words, in terms of his own need, and it goes this way. He said, the midrash makes an analogy. This could be likened to a king who had an only daughter. Another king from some other country came and took her in marriage. She married a king. And they stayed for a while in the first king's land, in the daughter's native land. But eventually, it was time for the king to return to his own land along with his wife. So the father of the daughter says to her husband, "My daughter, whom I gave you, is my only one. To separate from her, I cannot. To say to you, do not take her, I cannot, because she is your wife. So do me this favor. Wherever you go, make for me a tiny place where I may dwell near you, as I am not able to leave my daughter," sort of like an in-law apartment. And now getting to the point, "Thus said the Holy One, blessed be he to Israel. I have given you," what's the analogy to the daughter? The Torah. "To separate from it, I cannot. To say to you, do not take it, I cannot. Therefore, wherever you go, make for me one house in which I may dwell. As was said, let them make for me a mishkan."
I want to quickly go back to what you guys were talking about, continuity, schedules, benefits of being part of a community. One of the unique things about this class is that it is funded by the United Jewish Federation of Stanford, which is the purpose to create said community. I want to encourage you, next Saturday night is Tapestry. Rabbi Hoffman, all the rabbis who have been teaching with us will be teaching, and if you have not already signed up, it is a phenomenal opportunity to be part of the greater community, learn together, and spread knowledge. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I did. They're in that email that I gave you.
Levels, but stayed funded in terms of the language protection. You know, we rather concrete ways of.
I do, and I forget how it is that. It is so funny. Can you check my mind when you jam?
Yes, it's nice to know something good, but then they have always. Thank you so much. You know, we appreciate that. I'm going to. There should be like
If you
one state.
if you want to send me your email address, I'll send you the schedule.
So what else did you want me to say? What other words did you want me to use?
It's a nice idea.
Yeah, it's not politically for me,
What other adjective did you want me to
Then would
use?
be how it affects you.
I didn't want
Well, you don't have to, but I mean, that's I wanted to open up the possibility.
I was giving you the academic response as opposed to my personal emotion because, yeah, I don't like to.
I think theology is part of philosophy.
Theology is. Well, but I think in this case, I think what we were seeing in this case is we were seeing a possible transition from the theological notion of omnipotence to the need for community.
It usually is supposed to end at 11.